Dr. Jen, and we are going to talk about documenting. And there is more than one reason why it's so important that you document if you think you're being bullied. Most people think that the only reason to document is so that you can report the workplace bullying. But I'm here to tell you that there's more than one reason, good reason, for you to document what's happening to you at work. Now, there's different ways that you can document. And one of the best reasons I think that you should document is because of you, so that you get a good understanding of what's happening to you at work. And then later on, you can develop strategies to mitigate and reduce the harm from workplace bullying. People will tell you that you need to document to report. Well, I don't necessarily agree with that. Reporting is your decision that you make based on your organizational culture, who's around, who's in leadership, who's in HR, and what have they done to hold the bully accountable, if anything, up to this point. So we're going to talk about two different ways to document. One is for your own reasons to get a good understanding of what's happening, because one of the things we know in workplace bullying, especially if you're the target, is that you're not objective. And when you are emotionally involved and you're being abused, sometimes we don't get a good understanding, or we don't often have a good idea of what's happening because we're not objective. Documentation can help us get a better, more objective view of what's happening to us, as well as how we are responding. And both of those things are really important. And then we're going to talk about how to document to get a good understanding first. And then secondly, we'll talk about how to document if you're going to go to HR. Those are very different ways to document. The most important thing, as far as I'm concerned, is you. And you're getting a good idea of what's happening to you. So let's start with that. Don't do what I did, because I was terrible at documenting. I had a few Post-it notes here. I had stuff in my email. I had emails forwarded. I had paper copies of things. I had things written on my calendar. The first thing you need to do, which is best practice, is to develop a way of documenting that works for you. I've created a documentation template and a workbook to help you with documentation that I'll leave both of those links. They're complimentary and free, and I think they're really great. I really wish I would have had those when I was being bullied. So I'll leave those links below. But develop a tool that's efficient, effective way for you to gather information. Documentation is basically just pulling everything together about what's happening to you. So the most important pieces of your documentation, we're going to talk about what you need to include that I think are best practice and most important for you. For your personal documentation, not HR, is to date, time, where are you at, who's doing it, what's being done, what's your reaction, and what are other people's reaction. Okay, so for example, if you're in a meeting and you're being bullied, your documentation should reflect that. So if you're at a meeting, you should say 9 a.m. in the boardroom, and here's who was there. And then what did they do to you? So here's where documentation becomes a little bit complicated, because you don't want to just document what they said to you. You want to document everything, because workplace bullying isn't just verbal, it's also nonverbal. It's shoulder shrugs and eye rolls, okay? It's fist clenching and cyber, all of those things. So if you're in a meeting and people are rolling their eyes, you want to do the best to your ability to document how many times people rolled their eyes. So again, you're probably not going to whip out your documentation and write it all down. Maybe you tally, right? Maybe on your meeting agenda notes, you put ER for eye rolls, and then you just tally those, okay? Frequency is important. So do as much as you possibly can. And if it becomes so much, for example, the nonverbal, just say 15 plus. Okay. When you're documenting what people have said to you, verbatim is best. If you can write those things down, exactly what was said, who was present, even if people are just sitting there, it's important in this first couple of weeks when you're documenting to document those things as well. And you also, and this is very important, want to document what your own behavior. Excuse me. So, for example, if we're in a meeting together and I'm yelling at you and swearing at you and you become defensive back, you want to record that as well. You don't want this to get into the hands of HR or your bully, so keep it close to your chest, keep it confidential, and document as much detail as possible. I also know that it's not maybe always possible for you to document as soon as an incident is over. That's best practice. When it's fresh in your memory, that's the best time to document. I also know that that's not always possible, so do it when you can and when it's in your memory to the best of your ability. So, for example, the other thing I recommend is that, say you can't document during the day, but you can document when your workday is over. Do it as soon as you get in the car, or if you take an Uber or a bus home, do it on the way. And then use that opportunity as a way to let go and release whatever it was that has happened to you. That's also a good strategy to get into, is to let go and keep work at work, and you keep your own stuff at home and you don't think about work. Okay. Once you've documented for at least 2 weeks, date, time, place, who is doing the bullying, the primary, the secondary bullying, if bystanders were involved, what they were doing, as much as detail as possible, how many eye rolls, how many shoulder shrugs, how many curse words, what were those, and then your own reactions to what they did. Okay. And then when that's done, again, keep it confidential, because if a bully thinks you're documenting, they're going to think that you're going to report, and that's going to trigger them. I frankly wouldn't tell anybody I was documenting. I would just do it and keep it to myself. The other thing that's really important is artifacts when it comes to documenting. So if an email comes through and there's cyber abuse there, file that away. Right? I used to have a ton of folders with people's names on it, and I would just put those abusive emails into their folder. And any other artifact that shows and reinforces the date and time and who is there, and the abuse. And then you just want to do that for 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Okay. Then what I recommend is that you let it sit for a few days and you don't go look at it. Okay. And you prepare yourself to look at the documentation. But before we get into what you should do with that documentation, I want to jump ahead a little bit and talk about what you should do if you're going to document for HR. You should never turn in your documentation to HR that has the information about how you reacted. What you want to do for HR is merely provide them the facts of what was done to you. You want the date and time, as many documented incidences of bullying incidences as possible, who was there and what was done to you. Just the facts in a documented timeline. Okay. It doesn't mean that you have to document for 2 or 3 weeks to understand what's happening to you and then document again. What you can do is you can modify the documentation you have and take out some of that information about what was your response. Okay. The reason I tell you that to take out what your response was is because if you're a target of workplace bullying, human resources probably already has a narrative about you that looks like you're the problem. Okay. And if you're going to take your documentation into HR, what we want to make sure is that they have only the facts of what was being done to you. And we'll talk about whether you should report later, and if you do, how you can approach HR. But today we're just going to talk about what do you do with your documentation. Okay, so now that you have all of your documentation compiled, what you need to do is go through it. And you're really trying to take all of that information and sift it down into a way that's easily understandable. One of the things I should have mentioned earlier is that you want to have a tool for documentation that works for you and that's easy for you to compile. So if you go back and I look at how my documentation was a hot mess, there wasn't a system where I could compile how many times people rolled their eyes at me. How many times did people walk down the hall and turn their back? Because I didn't document those things. I just knew those things would happen. So make sure you're documenting in a way that you can easily go through it later and compile it. So the first thing I would recommend that you do when you're looking at your documentation is going through and making a list of all of the different times of abuse that you took, cyber abuse, and then break that down. Was it emails? Was it social media posts? What was it? And make a list just on a piece of paper or in a document that you can go in and tally those up, right? So once you have the whole list of all of the types of abuses that you have taken, then you just want the frequency for each of those. How many emails did you receive in that period of time you documented? How many times did people lie about you? How many times did someone roll their eyes or, clench their fist or block your way out of the doorway? And you want the frequency to the best of your ability. How many times did all of those things happen? Okay. And you want to know who is the primary or secondary aggressor. You might have more than one or two. You want to then make a list of who did what, right, to the best of your ability. Okay. And determine who do you think are the biggest bullies against you. Okay. And you could just make a hierarchy: bully 1, bully 2, bystander 1, bystander 2, bystander 3, right? And even make a list of people who maybe didn't engage in bullying. Maybe those people who kept their head down. And later we'll talk about why that's important. Okay. The other thing that you want to do is you want to make a list and figure out what are your reactions to when you're being bullied. Okay. So for example, some of the people that I worked with in the past, they become very defensive when a bully comes at them. Okay. And they respond in a way that's defensive. Myself, when a bully came at me through email, I always responded back. Okay. Not always my best move. Okay. So keep categories of how you're responding, both positively and negatively. Okay. When did you walk away? When did you de-escalate something? Okay. That's what you want to figure out. Then you want to take that information and figure out, if you can, the highest risk times that you're being bullied. Okay. Is it in meetings? Is it when you're alone with the bully, right? Maybe your bully is your boss and you have to go in and talk to that person pretty regularly, and that's when it happens. Determine the high risk times. I'd even rank those, okay, from the highest to the lowest. Again, later on, this information will become clear, okay? The reason documentation is so important, again, for you to get a good picture of what's happening to you, is sometimes when we're in that situation, we're not objective, okay? And we don't always take our own behavior into account. You're not responsible for being bullied, but sometimes what we do as targets is we also respond in a way that escalates the bully instead of de-escalates. Okay. And we often get focused on somebody stopping the bully rather than focusing on what we can do to mitigate the circumstances of workplace bullying. Okay. So hopefully, as you sift through all that data, okay, You figure out the high risk times, who's doing the bullying, the major categories that you're being bullied, and how you're responding. And those are going to be very, very important. Okay. If again, you're going to document for HR, you can take that information and just remove anything about the responses that you've said. You don't need to do anything for HR to view you as the problem, because a lot of times what happens when you're being targeted and being bullied is that the bully and the majority of the organization, like I said previously in a previous video, is they already believe that you're the problem. And when you take your documentation into HR, you're trying to paint a picture of what's being done to you, not of what you're doing. And so the two are very, very different. And I highly recommend that, again, you document to figure out what's happening to you so that later on you can look at how you can develop a plan to mitigate the workplace bullying. And yes, you can mitigate the workplace bullying and report. They're not mutually exclusive. But what happens is we don't think about you and helping you. We also often only, as targets of workplace bullying, focus on someone coming in to stop it, not what we can do to help reduce the traumatic effects of workplace bullying. And I think that's really important. Again, I'll put the links for the documentation template and the workbook below. I highly recommend that you download those. I think they're very valuable. Whether you decide to report or not, it's a great idea for you to get a good understanding what's happening to you. That's the first step. Because when we're involved and we're emotional in that situation, in that workplace that's abusive, sometimes we don't have an objective point of view about really what's happening, because sometimes it's happening so much, right? We may not be able to take it all in because it's happening so frequently. So documentation is a great way for you to understand what's happening to you. And also then later, if you want to, you can report to HR. If there's anything I can do, or you have any questions about documenting or the documentation template, please go ahead and email me at jan@stopbullyculture.com. I hope you're doing well, and thank you so much, and I will see you next time.